The Catholic Men's Podcast, Episode 3. I'm going to read a few chapters out of the book The FBI Story by Don Whitehead. Most of these stories are about the FBI busting gangsters and kidnappers like Babyface Nelson or John Dillinger, but a lot of people don't know how good they were at rounding up commies, who are either setting off bombs and killing people or stealing nuclear secrets. Everybody now says, oh, that was just McCarthyism at that time and everybody was just being paranoid about communists. But if you read these FBI stories, you see how real that threat was. So I hope you enjoy it because it's a real spy thriller that actually happened. This is the FBI story, Nuclear Secrets. Part 1. The New Enemy, Communism. The hour was nearing midnight in the nation's capital. The star-filled night was soft, warm, and peaceful. The lights winked out one by one in the fashionable homes on R Street Northwest. A car drove through the tree-lined streets and then swung into a garage at number 2131 R Street. Assistant Secretary of the Navy, Franklin D. Roosevelt, stepped out and entered into his home. Across the street, the new Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer and his wife had switched off the lights in the first-floor library and had gone upstairs. They were preparing to retire. It was 11:15 p.m., June 2nd, 1919. The Palmers were startled by a thump downstairs, which sounded as though something heavy had been thrown against their front door. Then the house was shaken by a mighty explosion. The blast blew in the front of the house, shattered the library, cracked the ceiling, broke windows, and knocked pictures from the wall. The windows were blown out in the Roosevelt's residence, and the house next door was badly damaged. Windows were shattered in the home of Senator Claude A. Swanson, 2 doors from the Roosevelts, and houses 2 blocks away were damaged. In the wreckage were bits of the bodies and clothing of the 2 men, apparently the dynamiters, destroyed by their own infernal machine. A fragment of one body fell on the Roosevelt doorstep. Another fragment of flesh was hurled through the window of the residence of the Norwegian minister a few doors from the Roosevelt home. The blast on R Street was echoed by 8 other explosions that June night in Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, New York, Boston, Cleveland, Newtonville, Massachusetts, and Paterson, New Jersey. At the scene of almost every bombing, police picked up handbills reading, "Plain words. The powers that be make no secret of their will to stop here in America the worldwide spread of revolution. The powers that be must reckon that they will have to accept the fight they have provoked. A time has come when the social question's solution can be delayed no longer. Class war is on, and cannot cease but with a complete victory for the international proletariat." Once the Communist Party's teachings and announced aims were accepted literally, then communism was not a political movement in the ordinary political sense. Neither was it an idealistic theory of government. It was a conspiracy so vast, so daring, that few people at first could even grasp the sweep of the communist vision. Part 2. The Scientist and the Stranger. It was December 3rd, 1943. The United States Fifth Army in Italy was slowly hacking a bloody path across the Nazi-held mountains toward Cassino. On the Russian front, the tide had turned against the Germans in the battle for Stalingrad. From out of the Atlantic's icy mists, the British transport Andes steamed into the sheltered waters of Norfolk, Virginia, and dropped anchor. The long, hazardous voyage from England was over, and the tension was draining out of the crew and the passengers. At the ship's rail, a small group of British scientists laughed and joked as the lines were made fast and preparations completed for them to go ashore. Tonight, New York City, a city that fairly sparkled with lights when compared with London, where people had stumbled through dreary blackouts for 4 long years. Beneath the excitement of arrival was another greater excitement. This was generated by being a part of a war effort so secret that only a handful of people knew its real meaning, and even among their own select group, they could only guess at what the future held. None of these men of science could know, in the pooling of their knowledge with the Canadians and Americans, they would harness the atom as a military weapon in the incredibly short time of 19 months. Not even the brilliant, sallow-faced young physicist, staring for the first time at the United States, could imagine such an achievement. An older scientist leaned on the ship's rail beside the young man, whose eyes seemed large and round behind his thick glasses. "There it is, Klaus," the older man said. The colony we traded for a cargo of tea, and I'm bloody glad to be here." Klaus Fuchs smiled. "I'm glad too. I've never been in the United States before." "Oh, you will find old friends?" "No," Fuchs said. "I have only a sister in Cambridge, Massachusetts." It was the truth. Fuchs knew no one well in America other than his sister. He had fled to England from Germany in 1933, after Hitler had risen to power in the Reich, just as many scientists had fled. When Germany and England went to war against each other, he had been interned briefly as an enemy alien, but the internment hadn't lasted long. Already he had established a reputation as an extraordinarily brilliant physicist and mathematician. That's why he was a member of this mission. No, Klaus Fuchs knew no one well in America other than his sister, but somewhere out there among the millions of people a stranger was waiting for him. Fuchs knew that one day he and this man would meet each other and would recognize the other. In that meeting, a bond would be formed, just as the bonds had been formed back in England with the stranger. A faceless, formless, nameless shadow. Each time it was the same. He was out there at this moment, walking strange streets in a strange city, waiting for the day, the hour, and the minute of their meeting. A voice called, "Klaus!" The young scientist blinked. He turned from the rail and hurried with the others down the gangplank. There was no bothersome red tape or checking by security officers. The Army had exclusive responsibility for guarding atomic security and for clearing personnel assigned to the Manhattan Engineer District, which directed the atomic energy program. The British had assured the Army's Manhattan Engineer District that Fuchs had been screened and found to be trustworthy and loyal. These assurances were accepted. Within a short time, the British group was en route to New York to enjoy the city's glitter and then to plunge into the atomic unknown. But one member of the group was not entirely engrossed with atomic problems. A few weeks after the arrival of the Andes, Klaus Fuchs strolled from the Barbizon Plaza Hotel on a windy Saturday afternoon. A few minutes later, he stepped from the subway in New York City's Lower East Side. Passers-by may have smiled faintly at the thin, sallow fellow bundled in an overcoat who carried a white tennis ball in his hand, but perhaps not. Even more uncommon sights go unnoticed on New York streets. And then Klaus Fuchs saw the stranger. The scientist knew him instantly by the gloves in his hand and the book with the green binding. He was middle-aged, perhaps 5 feet 10 inches tall, and stolidly built. His face was round and impassive. The stranger's eyes flicked to the tennis ball in Fuchs's hand. He spoke, and the two of them stepped into a cab. When they were seated at a table in a restaurant on Lower 3rd Avenue, the stranger said, "I am Raymond." Never was he to let Fuchs know that his real name was Harry Gold. A flicker of a smile twitched on the scientist's lips. "I am Dr. Klaus Fuchs," the stranger nodded. Fuchs told his companion of the super-secret Manhattan Engineer District. He talked of the concentrated effort to solve the scientific and industrial puzzle of quantity production of fissionable uranium and of the goal of harnessing the atom's energy to a military weapon. He promised specific details later, and after arranging a recognition symbol for the next meeting, they parted. In those few fleeting minutes, Klaus Fuchs and the stranger had unlocked an unguarded door leading to the most appalling crime in our time, the theft of atomic secrets for Soviet Russia. This was early 1944. In early 1949, the struggles on the battlefields of Europe and in the Pacific were a 4-year-old memory. Communist Russia no longer was an ally. She was, in non-diplomatic language, the Cold War enemy of the Western world. At his desk in the Department of Justice building on Pennsylvania Avenue, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover studied a top-secret report, and his face flushed with shock and anger. Here was information, reliable beyond a doubt, that agents of a foreign power had stolen the very heart out of the atomic bomb, stolen the secret of its construction and detonation. Hoover reached for the intercom telephone. He gave a series of orders to his key subordinates, and soon the vast machinery of the FBI was in high gear. In essence, Hoover's orders were, "The secret of the atomic bomb has been stolen. Find the thieves." Hoover and the FBI, not the Army, were now responsible for atomic security. The responsibility became effective of January 1st, 1947. And here in Hoover's hands was the information of a crime so shocking that it was to be called the crime of the century. Hoover's men swarmed into the Los Alamos atomic plant near Santa Fe, New Mexico, and other plants. They dug into records and personnel files of the Atomic Energy Commission and interviewed hundreds of people who might have some clue. Within a few days, the FBI reached the conclusion that the key figure in the crime had very likely been a member of a foreign mission, a man with free access to all the work done on the uranium processing and bomb assembly, and most likely a physicist. The British were notified of these conclusions. Near the end of September, the coil of evidence was tightening around Klaus Fuchs. On the known record, it seemed impossible. He was now the respected head of the Theoretical Physics Division of Britain's atomic energy establishment at Harwell, a man with a brilliant future. He seemed to have been a discreet fellow, totally absorbed in his work. The women who had known him remembered him as a shy, sweet guy, with no apparent interest in politics. British security had vouched for his loyalty. Then a small alarm bell sounded. An agent digging through old Nazi records seized by intelligence officers in Germany during World War II spotted an entry bearing the name of Klaus Fuchs. Translated, the entry said, "Klaus Fuchs, student of philosophy, December 29, 1911, Rüsselsheim, RSHA-IVA2, Gestapo Field Office, Kiel." The symbol A2 identified the special file into which the Gestapo dropped the names of those they listed as communists. In the communist file also was another name identified as that of a relative of this Klaus Fuchs. By itself, the old Gestapo file was proof of nothing. The Nazis, for political and other reasons, undoubtedly had accused many innocent persons of being communists. Still, the information couldn't be ignored. Agents sifted through every record they could find that might produce any sort of lead. They turned to the file of the 1946 Canadian spy case, in which Igor Guzinko, the cipher clerk, had fled from the Russian embassy at Ottawa to disclose the operation of an atomic spy ring. In this file was a photographic copy of an address book picked up by the Canadian police. Among the names was the entry, Klaus Fuchs, 84 George Lane, University of Edinburgh, Scotland. The bits and pieces of information, when joined together, all weighed against Fuchs. Hoover notified British intelligence MI5 of the new developments and suggested Klaus Fuchs as the man to watch. MI5 agents shadowed Fuchs. It was December 1949 when William J. Scardon, Harwell security officer, tapped on Fuchs's door. Once inside, he told Fuchs he was suspected of passing information to the Russians. Fuchs seemed surprised. "I don't think so," he blurted. Scardon persisted. He told Fuchs there was precise information that he had. Fuchs repeated, "I do not think so." "That's an ambiguous reply." "I do not understand," Fuchs said. "Perhaps you will tell me what the evidence is. I have not done any such thing." Fuchs continued to deny his guilt, but on January 24, 1950, he sent word to Scardon that he wished to see him. Scardon came to Fuchs's rooms. "You asked to see me here, and here I am." Fuchs said, "Yes, it is rather up to me now." It was plain that he was under strong emotional stress. Scardon suggested to Fuchs that he might as well unburden himself and clear his conscience by telling the full story. "I will never be persuaded by you to talk," Fuchs exclaimed. But after they had had lunch together, the confession came tumbling from Fuchs's lips. Yes, he had given the Russians atomic secrets from the time he began working on nuclear research in 1942 until a year ago. He had sought out the Russians himself and on his own initiative. Before he went to the United States, he was given the recognition signals and told where he would meet the stranger. Yes, there had been an irregular but frequent passing of atomic information to the Russians. From the time Fuchs confessed, the FBI concentrated on getting the answer to one question. Who was the stranger, the mystery man to whom Fuchs slipped atomic information on at least 10 occasions in New York, Santa Fe, New Mexico, and Cambridge? The single clue on which to work was a vague description by Fuchs of a man in his middle years, say 40 to 45, about 5 feet 10, solidly built, round face, not a physicist, probably not even an atomic employee, a man who knew something about chemistry, perhaps a chemist. He called himself Raymond, but obviously that wasn't his real name. Beyond this shadowy image, Fuchs could give no further help. Agents of the FBI called on Mrs. Crystal Heinemann, Fuchs's sister, and her husband in Cambridge. The Heinemans recalled that in late January 1945, a stranger had called at their home asking for Klaus, who hadn't yet arrived for his vacation with them. The Heinemans could recall no name. The information wasn't much help, except that the Heinemans' recollection of the stranger tallied with Fuchs's description, and it was confirmation of Fuchs's statement that he had turned over atomic information to Raymond in Cambridge. Gold's name had come to the FBI's attention in May 1947 during an investigation which grew out of information supplied by Miss Elizabeth T. Bentley, a self-confessed communist courier. The file showed that Gold was a chemist. On May 15, 1950, some 6 weeks after Fuchs's conviction, the two FBI agents visited the Philadelphia hospital and asked Gold if he would give them an interview. "Of course," Gold said, "but we are very busy at the moment. Would you come back this evening?" The agents returned after dinner. Gold was waiting for them. He recalled he had been questioned by the FBI on another occasion, and he asked what it was they wanted to know this time. He was shown a picture of Klaus Fuchs and exclaimed, "This is a very unusual picture. He is that English spy." Then he added that he didn't know Fuchs, of course, but he had recognized his face because of all the newspaper publicity. No, he didn't know the Heinemans in Cambridge or anyone in Santa Fe, New Mexico. As a matter of fact, he had never been in New England or west of the Mississippi River. He answered questions willingly and even with an air of candor, as a man with nothing to hide. But the agents noted discrepancies in Gold's story, small flaws, nothing of any vital importance, merely evasions and occasional denials of things which the agents knew to be true. A week passed, during which Gold was questioned several times, and finally he said to the agents, "I've told you everything I know. I've got nothing to hide. If it'll help, go ahead and search the place." He gave his written consent for the search of his home, a 2-story row house at 6823 Kindred Street in Philadelphia. At Gold's suggestion, the agents started their search in the bedroom, the room where he had most of his papers, books, journals, and letters. Gold made himself comfortable in a chair. This would take time. One of the agents looked behind a bookcase, which obviously hadn't been touched in years. He picked up a yellow folder, one of those Chamber of Commerce maps for tourists. It was a map of Santa Fe, the capital city. The agent spread the map open. "You said you'd never been west of the Mississippi. Or have you?" Harry Gold stared at the map. For a long minute, no one spoke. The agents stood watching Gold and waiting. Then suddenly, he seemed to crumple like a man so bone-weary that he couldn't carry his burden another step. Gold said, I am the man to whom Klaus Fuchs gave his information." Just as with Klaus Fuchs, once the words began, they came in a steady flow. He told of meeting Fuchs in New York and Cambridge and Santa Fe, detailing how he picked up the information and gave it promptly to John, whom he later identified as Anatoly A. Yakovlev, Russian vice consul in New York. But why was it men like these that betrayed their own country and spying for a cause which had made a mockery of freedom for millions of people? Gold's explanation was an old, familiar refrain, confused idealism leading to treachery. "I began the work of industrial spying for the Soviet Union in 1936 with the full realization of what I was doing. I thought it would be helping a nation whose final aims I approved, along the road to industrial strength." FBI agents followed the spy trail to Dr. Klaus Fuchs, and from Fuchs to Philadelphia chemist Harry Gold. From Gold, the path branched into a maze of treachery. Gold recalled for the FBI the paths he had trod for 14 years as a Soviet agent. One of those paths led to a 28-year-old ex-Army sergeant, David Greenglass, who lived with his wife, Ruth, and their 2 children at apartment number 6, 265 Rivington Street, New York City. Greenglass was in the kitchen preparing the baby's milk formula when 2 FBI agents knocked on the door. It was 1:46 p.m., June 15, 1950. Mr. Greenglass left the kitchen and opened the door. "Mr. Greenglass? David Greenglass?" "Yes." "May we come in?" Greenglass nodded, and the 2 visitors stepped into the room. "We're from the FBI," one of the agents said. They showed their identification. "We are trying to locate information on materials lost, misplaced, or stolen at the Los Alamos project. You worked at Los Alamos, didn't you?" "Yes," Greenglass said. "But I can't help you. I know nothing about it." The agents continued to question the ex-sergeant. Would he have any objections if they looked around the apartment? He could refuse if he wished, of course. "I have nothing to hide," Greenglass persisted. "Go ahead." He signed a waiver of search. A few minutes later, one of the agents left the apartment with 24 pictures of Greenglass and his wife, including a snapshot taken while Greenglass was in uniform during World War II. The agent took the pictures to Harry Gold. The chemist studied them. At last, he said, "This is the man I contacted at Albuquerque." "When did you contact him?" the agent asked. "In June 1945. "On whose instructions?" "I was acting on instructions from my Soviet espionage superior, John. The man in this picture gave me information about his work at Los Alamos, and I turned over the information to John." "Will you sign a statement to that effect?" Gold nodded. For a time, Greenglass protested his innocence, but then, like that of Fuchs and Gold, his part of the story finally spilled forth, piece by piece. The parts fell into place. No one person had all the information, but when the FBI gathered essential parts, there was the clear picture of espionage. Here follows the story as it was given to the FBI and later revealed in the testimony in federal court. On November 29, 1944, 3 months after Sergeant David Greenglass's transfer to the secret Los Alamos atomic bomb project, Ruth Greenglass arrived in Albuquerque, New Mexico. David had managed to wangle 5 days' leave from his job as a machinist. He met Ruth at the Hotel Franciscan. This was their second wedding anniversary. One day, while walking along Highway 66, out beyond the city limits, Ruth told David about a talk she'd had with Julius and Ethel Rosenburg in New York. Ethel was David's sister. Ruth said that Julius had told her that he and Ethel had dropped their Communist Party activities. They didn't attend club meetings or subscribe to the Daily Worker. David was surprised. But why? Because Julius said at last he's doing what he always wanted to do, giving information to the Soviet Union. Ruth said that Julius knew what David was doing too. David was working on the atomic bomb, the deadliest weapon ever conceived by man. Julius and Ethel wanted David to give them information about this work, which would be useful to Russia. They said Russia was an ally, and she wasn't getting the information that she deserved to have. If all nations had this atomic information, then, Julius said, one nation couldn't use this bomb as a threat against the other nation. David was scared. I can't do it, Ruth, he said. But next day he saw things differently. He agreed. Julius had been his hero for years. Julius and Ethel had persuaded him to join the Young Communist League when he was 14. David gave Ruth a description of the Los Alamos layout, the approximate number of people working in the restricted area, and the names of scientists whose connection with the atomic project was supposed to be top secret. He had picked up their names by overhearing talk at the plant. Ruth memorized all David told her and repeated it to Julius Rosenburg when she returned home. A day or so later, the Greenglasses went to the Rosenbergs' apartment for dinner. Julius said to Ruth, "How would you like to go to Albuquerque to live?" "I would be very happy," Ruth exclaimed. "You're going to be there," Julius said. He told her not to worry about money. He would take care of the expenses. The money would be a gift, and it would come from the Russians. Later, the talk turned to finding a means by which David would be able to identify any stranger who might come to get information for Julius. "Well," Julius said, "I'll give you something so that you will be able to identify the person who does come." Ruth and the Rosenbergs went into the kitchen. Julius cut the side from an empty Jell-O box and then cut the piece of cardboard into 2 notched parts. He gave one half to Ruth Greenglass, and the 3 of them returned to the living room. David Greenglass saw the 2 pieces of cardboard and how the notched edges would fit when joined together. "No," he said, "that's very clever." Julius smiled. The simplest things are the cleverest. The Greenglasses had just finished breakfast when the stranger knocked. David opened the door. "Are you Mr. Greenglass?" "Yes." Gold stepped into the living room. He said, "I come from Julius." "Oh, you arrived sooner than I expected," Greenglass said. Then he picked up his wife's purse and fished out the piece of Jell-O box. Gold produced the other half. The pieces matched. Gold said, "Have you any information for me?" David said, "I have some, but I'll have to write it up. If you come back later, I'll give it to you." The stranger left, and Greenglass went to work. He drew sketches of the lens mold on which he had been working and described in writing how the lens was used in triggering a device in atomic experiments. Again, he listed names of people he regarded as possible espionage recruits. Gold came back in mid-afternoon. He took the information from Greenglass and left behind the envelope containing $500. After Gold's arrest, Julius urged David to leave as soon as possible by way of Mexico, Sweden, or Switzerland and Czechoslovakia. He gave David traveling instructions and a total of $5,000 in cash. But Greenglass didn't go. Julius and Ethel Rosenburg, Morton Sobel, and David Greenglass were indicted by a federal grand jury on charges of conspiracy to commit espionage, a violation of the Federal Act of 1917. The Rosenburg-Greenglass trial opened on March 6, 1951, in the United States Courthouse in Foley Square, New York. The jury found the Rosenbergs and Sobel guilty of violating the espionage statute, which provided that those found guilty shall be punished by death or by imprisonment for not more than 30 years. The courtroom was hushed on the day Judge Kaufman was to pass sentence, April 5, 1951. "Is there anything defendants wish to say?" Julius Rosenberg said. "No, sir." The judge looked at Ethel Rosenberg. "Do you care to say anything?" "No, sir." Judge Kaufman began speaking. "I consider your crime worse than murder. Plain, deliberate, contemplated murder is dwarfed in magnitude by comparison with the crime you have committed. In committing the act of murder, the criminal kills only his victim. But in your case, I believe your conduct in putting into the hands of the Russians the A-bomb, years before our best scientists predicted Russia would perfect the bomb, has already caused, in my opinion, the communist aggression in Korea, with the resultant casualties exceeding 50,000. And who knows but that millions more of innocent people may pay the price for your treason. Indeed, by your betrayal, you undoubtedly have altered the course of history to the disadvantage of our country. What I am about to say is not easy for me. I have deliberated for hours, days, and nights. I have carefully weighed the evidence. Every nerve, every fiber of my body has been taxed. I have searched the records. I have searched my conscience to find some reason for mercy, for it is only human to be merciful, and it is natural to try to spare lives. I am convinced, however, that I would violate the solemn and sacred trust that the people of this country have placed in my hands were I to show leniency to the defendants, Rosenberg. It is not in my power, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, to forgive you. Only the Lord can find mercy for what you have done. You are hereby sentenced to the punishment of death." Greenglass received a 15-year prison term, but before the Rosenbergs died as traitors in Sing Sing Prison's electric chair, their case was to be given one of the most careful and thorough reviews of any case in American criminal history. It was reviewed 16 different times on various points by the United States District Court, but Judge Kaufman's decision stood. And that was the end of the trial. The end of the FBI story. Thank you so much for listening, and God bless. And don't forget to leave me some suggestions about the next thing I should read in the comments.